I'm excited to welcome you to the absolute best video on the return keyword you'll find anywhere on YouTube. In this video, I cover everything you need to know in detail and use interactive animations, beautiful illustrations, and professional editing to ensure you remain engaged in order to maximize your learning. So let's jump in. So let's start off by talking about the purpose of functions. Functions can be used for two different purposes. The first purpose is to perform actions. These are side effect actions that do not give back a value. So for example, we have the function app_status, which is just printing the app status to the console. I want to highlight that for this kind of function, no actual value is outputted. What I mean by this is that in our program, we're not outputting an actual value that we can use inside our program. We're just printing something to the console. So yes, while a value may be outputted in the console, this function does not actually produce a value inside our code that we can use. The second purpose of a function is to return values. This is when we want to calculate something and return the result to be used elsewhere in our program. For example, the function calculateArea is calculating the area by taking in a width and height and multiplying them by each other. Inside our program, we could call calculateArea, and what we can do is then store the results of this inside a variable. So let floor area equal calculateArea with the arguments 150. So when this function executes, the result of width times height, which is 5,000, would then be stored in the variable floor area. We could then use this result to say work out the number of tiles we need to cover our floor area. So the main purpose of these functions is to perform a calculation whereby the result is actually being used later on in our program. It's not just being printed to the console. Now, this won't work. That is, we're trying to perform a calculation inside our function and get out a value. Let's go play around with this inside VS Code. So I've gone ahead and set up a new index.html file, and I've linked a JavaScript file called app.js. So let's go create the first kind of function, which is just to perform an action. Let's declare a function, calculatePerimeter. I'll grab our parentheses and curly brackets. Inside the parentheses, I'll take in a width and height. Let's calculate the perimeter. We'll calculate the perimeter by defining a new variable, let perimeter equal 2 times the width plus 2 times the height. And then I'm just going to output this result to the console. So checking this out, let's go call this function, calculatePerimeter. I'll give it the values 5 and 10. Refreshing the console, you'll see we're outputted the value 30. So that's the first kind of function, where we're performing an action, like outputting something to the console. But what I want to make crystal clear is that we're not outputting a value inside our code that we can then use. We just outputted something to the console. So now let's talk about the second purpose for functions, which is to return a value to then use inside our program. So we'd get rid of the console.log, and you would think we might just do something like this. 2 times the width plus 2 times the height. Now this calculation would be outputted when we call this function. Let's go capture that value so that we can use it. We'll declare a new variable, let total perimeter equal calculatePerimeter. So what we would expect is that when this function executes over here, we'd get back the value 30, which is then stored in total perimeter, which we could use later on. For example, maybe we want to work out the cost of fencing, where the fence per meter is $100. So we could do let total cost equal total perimeter multiplied by $100. All right, let's refresh, and you'll see nothing is appearing in the console here. I'm going to type in total perimeter just to see the value of total perimeter, which I would expect to be 30. But we're just getting back undefined, which means total perimeter doesn't have a value. So you can see simply doing this doesn't work. So to get this to work, we need to use the return keyword. JavaScript assumes a function returns nothing unless you explicitly tell it to return something. And this is in fact done a lot of the time. Functions are mostly used to return values we can use later on in our program. So looking back at the calculateArea function, to output the calculated value of width times height, we have to use the return keyword, which you can see over here. This is telling the function to explicitly return a value. If you don't do this, JavaScript is assuming you want to return nothing. So for something like just printing to the console, you don't use the return keyword. because we're not actually outputting a value to be used in our program. We're just printing something to the console. So let's go play around with this inside VS Code. Alright, so picking up where we left off, we saw that simply executing this code didn't actually return the value. So let's now go add the return keyword over here. I'll refresh the console. I'll look for total perimeter, and you can see it now does have the value 30. So by using the return keyword, we're explicitly telling this function to actually return a value. So once again in our code, when this function executes, the result of perimeter will be 30, and this value is now stored in the variable perimeter. If I go and get the total cost, you'll see that's also being calculated to be $3,000. That is the total perimeter multiplied by 100. So using the return keyword is critical when you want to return a value when you execute your function, which is going to be a lot of the time in your programming. Now just to show you a few other things, you could also write this code like this. Let perimeter equal this calculation, and then we could just return the value for perimeter. If I refresh, you'll see total perimeter is the same and total cost is the same. So all I've done here is split my code into two. I declare a new variable inside the function where the calculation is happening. This variable now contains the calculation, and then I just return the value stored inside this variable. Now this way can be considered more readable, especially when you have much longer calculations. You perform the calculation on one line and store it in the variable, and then you simply just return that variable. One other thing I'd like to show you is that you can both print to the console and return a value. So your function can be doing two things. I could also grab console.log and print the value of perimeter to the console. Once again, this is just performing an action. And at the same time, I can also return the value of perimeter to be used later on. I'll refresh. You can see we get back 30, which is being handled by this line here. But the value of perimeter is also being returned to be used later on in our program. Just to make this very clear, let's go console.log the value of total cost. So I'll refresh. This 30 over here is just printing to the console from our function, whereas this value 3000 is the value of the total cost, which was achieved by explicitly returning the value of perimeter and using that in a calculation down here. Alright, I'm just going to go remove all this code, and I'm going to paste in the function we declared in the previous video. We were calculating the final price of an item on an e-commerce website. All we were doing here was outputting the result to the console. So if I refresh, you'll see we're outputting the final price of each item. Now let's say as a user, on the e-commerce site, I am buying these three items. Using the function we have here, I wouldn't actually know the grand total cost, because all I'm doing is outputting the value to the console. What I need to be able to do is sum up the value of each item. So to do that, instead of doing a console.log, I'm now going to go return the total. So when each of these execute, I'll be getting back a value. Now, just to simplify this, I'm no longer using the item name. So let's just go remove it. And I'll remove it as a parameter here. Now, when each of these executes, we will get back an actual number. So let's go store those numbers in a variable. We'll do let shoes cost equal our function. Let's do let jacket cost equal this function. And finally, let headphone cost equal this function here. So now each of these variables will be storing the value that is returned from our function. It now means we can calculate the grand total. So I'll do let grand total equal shoe cost plus jacket cost plus headphone cost. And then I could output this grand total to the console. Okay, I'll refresh, and you can see we now get back the grand total of each of these items. The big thing here, compared to just having a console.log like we had at the start, is that we are returning a value, which we are then storing in a new variable, and then using that value in our program. Now, just to show you another way of writing this, is that we don't have to declare these as separate variables. We could just execute the function directly in the grand total calculation here. So I could replace shoes cost with calling the function here. I could replace jacket cost with calling the function here. And I can replace headphone cost with calling the function here. I could then remove each of these. I'll refresh, and you see we get the exact same thing in the console. Now once again, the reason this works is because when we call this function, we are returning a value. So by calling this function with the argument 80, 80 goes here. We have 80 times by 1 minus the discount of 0.2 times by 1 plus the tax rate of 0.1 plus the delivery fee of 5. This gives us a value of 75.4. We then need to explicitly return 75.4, which then gets placed over here. So that is another way of doing it, but I would generally prefer doing this. It just makes our code a bit more readable. So let's now look at functions with returns in action. Looking at our flight booking website, let's look at the function being used to calculate the total airfare. We would have a function declaration like this: calculate airfare, which has the parameters base price, number of adults, number of children, and number of infants. We would then declare variables that look like this, where we calculate the ticket price for an adult, child, and infant. The adult cost is just the base price times by the number of adults. The child cost is the base price times by 0.75 times by the number of children, because usually child tickets are a bit cheaper. And then the infant total is the base price times by 0.1 times by the number of infants, because an infant ticket is really cheap. We would then have some logic to apply any discount. So over here we have let total passengers equal the number of adults plus the number of children. We initially define the discount to be 0. However, if the total number of passengers is greater than or equal to 3, we update the value of discount to 20. We can then work out the total cost, which is the adult total plus the child total plus the infant total minus any discount. We then return the total value so that it can be used later on in our program. For example, as I move through this booking, I need to add other items onto this total, like seat selection fees or extra baggage. So let's wrap up by building a summary card, return. We saw that for cases like this, where we need to return a value, which is used later on in our program, writing this won't work. We need to use the return keyword, like this, which is telling our function to explicitly give us back a value, which is used later on in our program. In this functions topic, we're going to be working on a shipping calculation project. We'll first take a look at some starter code without functions. We'll then refactor this code with function declarations. We'll then add function expressions. Then we'll add arrow functions. And finally, we'll refactor with nested functions. So let's now jump into VS Code and complete the first 2 steps. Alright, so I've gone ahead and created a new folder called Shipping Calculator. Inside here, I have an index.html linking to a JavaScript file called app.js. Inside app.js, I actually have some starter code, which is our shipping calculator that doesn't use functions. I recommend you download the starter file in the description and code along with me. So let's go through this code line by line and then see how we can use functions to improve it. So our first 2 lines of code are taking in values from the user via prompt. The first thing we're asking the user is to enter the destination zone, like US for USA, IN for India, AU for Australia, etc. We're then asking to enter the package weight in kilograms. We then wrap this with parseFloat because we know that prompt will always give us back a string. And we use parseFloat to convert that string into a number which can contain decimals. We then declare a variable let cost and don't yet assign it a value. We then declare these 2 variables, let per kilogram rate for US equal $4, and let per kilogram rate for other countries equal $6. We then have this nested if statement, that is, an if statement inside another. The reason for this code we need a nested if statement is that we first need to check is the zone US or not. The reason we're doing that is that because for this e-commerce site, they're based in the US and will either ship locally, which has a specific set of costs, or internationally, which has a higher cost. So the first thing we're checking over here is, are we in the US? If that is the case, then we're calculating the cost of shipping for different weights. If the weight is less than or equal to a kilogram, the cost is a flat rate of $10 plus the weight times by the rate per kilogram rate for the US, which is $4. This logic is then repeated for different conditions, for when the weight is less than or equal to 1, less than or equal to 5, or above 5, where you can see the cost has different base costs, and we're just adding on the weight times by the per rate kilogram for the US. This logic is then repeated inside this else statement, which is for any other country in the world where we're using different values. You can see the base cost here is 25, over here is 40, and over here is 60. And the per kilogram rate for other countries is 6. Now, you could have just hard-coded this so that each of these were 4 and each of these were 6. I've just declared them as different variables up here so that if in the program you wanted to just update it, you could just do it in one location. Finally, we're outputting to the console the zone name the user entered and the shipping cost. So let's check this out in the console. So you can see the first prompt appears. It's asking for my destination zone. I'll put the US and the package weight in kilograms. I'll put 2.5. All right, great. You can see the console is outputting US shipping cost is $30. Let's refresh. I'm now going to put AU for Australia and a package weight of 6.8 kilograms. You can see now we get AU shipping cost is $100.80. So what I'd now like to do is refactor this code, which means improve the code to use functions to better contain some of this logic. So instead of using these nested if statements, what I'm going to go do is define a function called calculate US. This function will take in a weight, and then all I'm going to do is just copy this code and place it inside the function body. I'm then going to declare another function called calculate other, give it a weight variable, and then I'm just going to copy this block over here and paste it inside the function body here. So what this now does, it just makes our code a bit more readable. The logic that calculates the US shipping cost is nicely contained inside this block of code. And the logic used to calculate the cost for other countries is nicely contained inside this function. So I'm now just going to remove all of this. All right, so we have the functions which calculate the cost. We now need some logic to determine which function to call. So I'll define a new if statement where I want to check, does the zone strictly equal US? If that's the case, I want to call the function calculate US, and the argument I want to pass in is weight. Weight just contains a value. It's the value we obtained from the input prompt. So this may look like a parameter and not an argument that is a value, but this is an actual value. Weight is this variable over here, which will contain an actual value. So for example, when the program runs, we might enter 6.5. So weight is 6.5, which means we're entering 6.5 over here. So although this may look like a parameter when we're calling the function, this is actually an argument. Now before we move on, something really important we need to do is actually return the values here, because we're going to use them later on in our program. To make this concise, I'm just going to go get rid of cost and put return. Now if I really wanted to, I could leave it as cost and return cost, but it's just going to get a bit repetitive, and this calculation is quite simple, so I'm just going to return the calculation directly without declaring a new variable. So return over here, 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 and return over here. Okay, so now that I've replaced the cost variable with a return statement, I can go remove the declaration up here. The whole point of declaring this cost variable was to then set a value inside these if statements. But now we're just returning the value directly. So I'm just going to remove the declaration of this variable over here. So now that we're returning a value, when we execute this function, let's go store that in a variable. Let cost equal calculate US with the weight. Now, of course, I could call this variable whatever I like let total equal calculate US. In my case, I've just called it cost. I just don't want you to be confused how before we had a cost variable over here. This cost variable was originally storing the value of the cost when we didn't have functions. But now that we have functions and are returning a value, we no longer need this cost, whereas this cost over here is now storing the value returned from the function. Using the same phrase as before, let's go output this to the console with zone, shipping cost, cost, where cost over here is what we've just calculated when we execute the function. And the value of zone we get from what the user inputs. We then need an else statement, where I'm just going to copy the same logic, but instead of calculate US, we're going to be calculating other. All right, let's refresh the console and check this out. I'll enter US and a weight of 2.5. We get a US shipping cost of $30. So the output we're getting is the exact same as what we had before, but now we're using functions, which I hope you can see better contain the logic for each calculation. Now, just to walk you through this in a bit more detail, let's go do another example. Let's go India and put a value of 3 kilograms. So the value of zone is now IN, and the value of weight is 3. So looking down our code, these are just our function declarations. The logic of our program is over here. If zone is strictly equal to US, well, our zone currently is IN, so this will be false, which means this won't run, which means this will run over here. We have let cost equal calculate other with the argument weight. Weight is equal to 3, so this is 3. Now this function over here is being called with an argument, so it means that this function declaration will now run. Weight is 3, Inside our function, we have is 3 less than or equal to 1? Well, this is false, so it won't run. Over here, else if weight is less than or equal to 5, 3 is less than or equal to 5, so this is true, which means this will be calculated over here. 40 plus the weight of 3 multiplied by the per kilogram rate other, which over here is 6. So this is 6. Order precedence means that this will be calculated first. 3 times 6, which is 18, and 40 plus 18 is 58. This value is then returned from what we executed here, so this is replaced by 58. So then the final console.log is zone, which we know is India. Shipping cost is the cost of 58 over here. And you can see this is outputted to the console over here. Okay, I'm just going to put this all back. Now, one thing you may be thinking is, why am I repeating this console.log over here and over here? Can't I just remove this and put this outside over here? So let's refresh. I'll put IN for India and 3 for kilograms. You can see we're getting back the value undefined. Now, the reason this is happening is because of a concept called scope, which we're going to be talking about soon. But in a nutshell, the variable cost is defined inside this if block, and we're actually not able to access it. So it means we need to run this console.log inside the if block. Now, another thing that may have crossed your mind is, how are we actually getting this weight value inside this if statement? It's not like we have inside here, let weight equal 3. The value for weight is actually outside the if statement over here. Even though it's defined outside this if block, we're still able to get access to it. So how come that's the case? Now, the reason we're able to get this is through something called global scope, which we'll also be talking about later. For this part of the project, I just want you to walk away understanding that we've now removed these nested if statements, which were a bit confusing to look at, and we've contained logic for the US shipping rate and the other shipping rate inside their own functions. So functions not only help give us reusable code, they also help contain specific logic, like we see over here. If you've enjoyed this style of teaching and are looking at mastering JavaScript, you can join me in my JavaScript full course, which is available for free on my channel. The course is designed for complete beginners and covers everything you need to know to code JavaScript at a professional level. In the course, you'll experience the same high-quality teaching and build a whole range of real-life projects from scratch. Join me today, and also make sure to subscribe to the channel to stay in the loop with new releases. See you in the JavaScript full course.